We're going to go back to Sunday school as I was a kid. Enjoyed Brother Kevin's lesson. And most of us here are old enough to have seen many changes in this world. I can remember hearing people talk about changes. You know, my grandparents, just like Kevin was talking about, our parents got to see Israel become a nation again. I mean, think about that. My mom and dad remember when Israel did not exist. Israel's always existed in my lifetime. Now, I knew it had not, I knew that. But my parents, Tim's parents, well, no, Kevin's parents wouldn't have known. Well, Brother Wayne might remember. He would have been a little kid, though. But I don't think much about it in a way, because to me, Israel was already back. But it wasn't then. That had to, people who were believers back then, that had to really be, wow, it's happened. But you know, there's something that's happened in our lifetime. Everyone's sitting here. Jerusalem has been recognized by the United States as the capital of Israel. Now, not every nation does that, but still, that's a big change. Not that the United States is a big deal. We're not. You don't find us in the Bible anywhere, except maybe those isles that it talks about, and those nations that are going to come. See, Christ talked about, David talked about, the nations other than Israel that were going to flock to worship God. So we might be mentioning there, you know, but it's just amazing, like Kevin said, it's just amazing. Now, if you look at it the wrong way, it will get you down in the dumps to see what's happened to our nation. I can also remember when abortion was not legal. I remember when that happened. And that is a curse on our nation. There's a lot of other things too. Evilness, wickedness that's put up, just weirdness and perverseness. But anyway, that's not my lesson, so I'm going to get off that. What I would like for you to do is turn to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Very familiar story. Most children, well, maybe not nowadays, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what goes on in other churches, but most children learn about this story as a child. David and Goliath. The world is affected by that, and some people maybe even use it and don't even know what it's talking about. You always hear the term, a David and Goliath situation. Okay, you hear it all the time, and tied to many different things. But anyway, we're going to read here, starting verse 1, and pray for me that my voice does not give out, because we are going to be doing a lot of reading. It says, now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together in Shokin, or Shocho, however you say that, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shoko, Azekah, and Ephes-dammim, well, whatever that one is, I don't know. And Saul and the men of Israel gathered together and pitched in the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on this one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, and Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span, which my Bible says here in the notes that was about 9 feet 9 inches tall, which pretty close to what the ceiling is here. Not that tall maybe, but those panels should be 8 foot. And it's pretty close. Those panels should be 8 foot plus almost, yeah. So almost as tall. Can you imagine that? A man that big? I mean, I've seen some tall, Brother Tim's tall. And I've met a few that are even taller than him. I got a customer that I was in a four-wheel drive Ford that had running boards on it. And I went to his shop. I stepped out on those running boards, which the running boards were this far off the ground, the big four-wheel drive. I stepped off on the running boards. He came out to meet me, and I'm looking at him eyeball to eyeball. I looked at him, I said, man, so this is what it's like all the time for you, huh? To be able to see from that height. But Goliath was bigger than that. And I don't think he was tall and skinny. I think he was tall and fit, because he had been a warrior from his youth. That's what the Bible says. He'd been a warrior from his youth. Anyway, so he comes out. He had a helmet of brass on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Now, again, in my notes in my Bible, it says that's 166 pounds. Just his coat of mail. All right, didn't talk about how much his helmet weighed, but his coat of mail. He had greaves of brass on his legs, a target of brass between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, which was big. Have you ever seen one of them big looms or whatever? They're big. Parts of that thing are big. How much that thing weighed, I don't know, but it was big. It said the head of his, the spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and one bearing a shield went before him. Now, I kind of tried to calculate that, and I'd come up with about 20 pounds on the spearhead. That's a lot of weight on a spearhead. I ain't seen many spears. I don't know I ever saw one that had a head on it that would have weighed 20 pounds. He was a big man. And I think he was an expert in war, too. I don't think he was no slouch. I don't think he was just relying on being big. And he had all this stuff, and yet it was enough that there was one thing he couldn't carry, that most people in that situation, they did carry their own shield. Okay, if you see pictures, drawings of the Romans, they had their shield, they had their sword. Almost all of it, they had it. He's big enough. For one thing, he needed a big shield, because he's big. So one man went before him carrying the shield for him. All right? So he was like a tank, right? I mean, he had the weapons, he had the height, he had the advantage, and he had the guy in a shield before him. He had 4 eyes watching for the enemy versus other soldiers just had 2. But anyway, so he stood and cried to the armies of Israel. They're on this side of the valley, and he goes out. He must have had a pretty good voice too. Now, that guy I was telling you about, one of my customers, he's got a voice. His voice matches his height and his stature. I mean, it's booming. So I figure Goliath must have had one too, because he's going out there in this valley and he's speaking loud enough they know what he's saying. They have no trouble understanding what he's saying. But anyway, he says, he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye the servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. But he goes one step farther. He makes a bargain, but he goes one step farther. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. So what he does here, they're ready to fight. I don't know if they'd had any skirmishes yet. I don't know. They might have, they might not. I don't know. But he says, this seems like a good deal. I come out, 2 guys fight. I win, you become our servants. He kills me, we become your servants. Takes care of a lot of things. Takes care of not there being a whole lot more bloodshed. Of course, he wasn't looking at it that way. He was looking at it. He had no doubt he could kill whoever they sent. Okay? And it would just make things a lot simpler. But he said, I defy the armies of Israel. Didn't just make the deal, make the bargain. He said, I defy the armies of Israel. In other words, you ain't nothing. You're chicken. I defy you. When Saul was not a little man, he was king. said he was a head and shoulders above all Israelites. So he was not a little man. And he wasn't a chicken. He had fought, Now he got himself in trouble because he disobeyed God. He thought he knew better. But that's not the lesson today. But said Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, humanly speaking, I probably would have been too. Especially if I was going to be the one chosen to go out and fight that guy. Humanly speaking. That's what we face every day. We're humans. My brother Kevin's talking about seeing the things that are happening, and a lot of them are horrible. But again, as you look at the other side of that, it's just telling us, Jesus is saying, I'm coming. I'm on my way. We don't know when. That's one thing you got to watch about predicting. Because the Bible is very clear that nobody knows but God in heaven. Christ even said, angels don't even know. So we don't know. We can just see it sure looks like it's soon. Doesn't mean it's going to be soon. It could be right now. It could be before we leave here. It could be, because certainly the things are, as far as we can tell, there. But again, God's in charge. He has the time. He's not waiting to pick a time. He already knows when it is. And when He's ready, that's when it'll happen. We just have to be looking. That's the thing. We have to be looking, anticipating, and being busy. Don't sit down on our seats doing nothing. Don't sit down and, it's almost over, so we might as well just sit back and wait. No, we need to keep going and preparing and teaching and preaching and witnessing as individuals. Our church needs to keep going. Not sit down, it must be coming soon, so we might as well just take it easy for a while. No, we don't need to do that. Anyway, so Israel was afraid. They didn't have a big man. Saul was probably the biggest man they had. He was king. They weren't going to send him out there. Of course, he didn't volunteer either. But they didn't know what to do. They were greatly afraid, which tells us one thing. They weren't trusting God because they were afraid. Now, I'm not saying I wouldn't be afraid either, but I would be. I ain't gonna lie, I would be if I was put in that situation. But that's when we know our focus is not on God. Because the thing they should have done, and what we should do in the situation, is when we don't know what to do. What do? We're supposed to pray. Ask God to guide us, help us, know what to do. If we need bravery, to give us bravery. Or to give us whatever we need to do what He wants us to do. But they were afraid and dismayed, greatly afraid. Verse 12, now David was the son of that Ephrathite, of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. Now that's an interesting verse to me. What do we know about David's dad, Jesse? Nothing. Not really. We don't know his history. We know he had 8 sons. We know he was respected. We know that because it says he went for a man among men, for an old man in the days of Saul. We don't know why. Doesn't tell us. But there was something special about him. But we don't know what it was. But he was a special man. And he had 8 sons. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul in battle. They became Saul's soldiers. And the names of his 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, and the third was Shaman. Now we don't hear the names of the others at this point, but David was the youngest. And the 3 eldest followed Saul. No, they went to battle. They followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul. And he had been with Saul. If you read back in chapter 16, it talks about when he got called up to play the harp for Saul, when Saul was troubled. And he did that for a good while. But he finally went back home. But he said he went back, returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. 40 days. Sometimes in our picture of this, or sometimes when we talk about it, we think it's like he came up 1 or 2 days, and then David came on. No, 40 days. A month, basically, in 10 days, he did this every day. Verse 17 says, and Jesse said unto David. Now, of course, another thing, that also means that the armies had been out there for at least 40 days, if not more. I mean, the armies of the Philistines, the armies of Israel, they had all been out there on the battlefield. Now, I don't know if they actually, both armies came together any time during that time. I don't know. They could have. I don't know. But they were there, ready to fight. And this went on for 40 days. And Jesse said unto David, his son, take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp of thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look in how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So this kind of makes me think, as I was looking at this morning and before, it kind of makes me think they were having skirmishes. I don't know that for certain, but it looks like they may have had skirmishes. They also had this thing. So it could be if I don't know how it went, I don't know. But something was going on. So David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. And see, that's another thing that makes me think maybe they did have skirmishes, but again, that's just a thought, and it's not really even important. Verse 21, for Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran to the army, and came and saluted his brethren. As he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of Philistine. I mean, the armies were there, but he comes out from among them and makes his challenge again. And spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. Now, I have to admit, this has kind of always mystified me. They all fled from one man. It says they all fled. There was not just a few people fleeing. They all fled. Now, I've often wondered, but I know, I'm not in their situation either. Why didn't they all attack him? He's out there on his own, evidently. Why didn't they all attack him? All of them. Surely he couldn't. But again, it's easy to say when you ain't the first guy heading that direction. Because who knows how many he would take out before maybe they finally did get him, okay? And no one wants to be the point man, okay? Well, Goliath didn't care. He wasn't afraid. But anyway, this all happened. They fled from him, so afraid. They said in verse 25, and the men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel he is come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Taketh away the shame of Israel? Because they ran. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now see, first he says, take away the reproach of Israel. But then he says, he's defying God. Now, he's defying the armies of Israel, but they're the army of God. He said, who is he that he should defy the armies of the living God? Verse 27, the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the man, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Older brother gets angry because David's talking. Now, to remind you, here's the oldest brother, here's the youngest brother. This man has been out there in a battle. Don't know how much, but he's been out there. He gets ticked off when he hears David. What is going on? What is happening here? Why is this man allowed to do what he's doing? He's defying God. He gets ticked off. And he says, basically he's going, pointing his finger at David, said, you don't know. Who'd you leave watching those few sheep? He's just trying to demean David. I know you're just coming down here to see what's going on, see what's the battle. Well, see, you didn't know that. His dad sent him. His dad told him to go. He's doing what his dad said. Right? He didn't go down there on his own. He didn't go until Jesse told him to go. And Jesse gave him direct commands, and he followed those commands. It was just after he got there, he got interested in what was going on, and then we saw this one man, even though he was a big man, he's defying the armies of the living God. How can this be? He gets angry. I personally think he gets like we get sometimes. When we see someone doing what they think they're supposed to be doing for the Lord, and we get maybe not angry about it, but we're like, because we know we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And we try to put them down, or we try to discourage them. Partly because we know we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Because if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, we would be happy that they're doing what they're doing. I mean, unless it is anti-scriptural, that's different. This is not what we're talking about. David's cause was just. His question was just. It was right. But see, Eliab knew. And this is my opinion, it's just my opinion. I think he knew they should have been out there doing, but they were afraid. And sometimes we get that way. Sometimes we get afraid to do what we know we're supposed to be doing. We may not be going out doing all kinds of sin and things like that, but sometimes we just don't do what we know we're supposed to be doing. And that is sin in and of itself. But sometimes we get in our ideas, if we're not doing this, and we're not doing this, and we're not doing this, the things we call sins and sin, and they are sin, we're doing what we're supposed to do. Well, yeah, we're supposed to stay away from that stuff. But when we've got work to do for the Lord, and I'm as guilty as anybody or more, when we don't do what we're supposed to be doing, whether it's witnessing or just whatever He has for us, we're not doing right. The armies of Israel were not doing right. Eliab was not doing right because he was running just like the rest of them. And then David comes up here full of enthusiasm and what is going on, guys? Eliab, instead of thinking, he's right and joining him, he just gets mad and tries to put him down. And then verse 29, I love this answer David gives. He says, what have I now done? I'm sure him, he's got a history with Eliab. I mean, he's the older brother of David. There's history there, right? Any of you's got siblings know that. There's history between you. Depending on how many you got, it's how much history there is. I got 2 sisters. Believe me, there's history. Okay? Most of it's good. Some of it, okay, there's times, But anyway, most of it's good. Probably 99%, okay? But anyway, I said that to keep in trouble, in case they see this video, But anyway, no, just joking around. He said, what have I now done? He said, is there not a cause? He said, guys, what have I done? What have I done? Isn't there a cause? Isn't this true that there is a thing going on here? There is a cause. Is there not a cause? And he was absolutely right. There was a cause. And you know what? In our lives, there is a cause. What is that cause? Preach the gospel to every creature. That's a pretty big cause. Because would you say the majority of the people in the world are saved? Mm-mm. In fact, the Bible talks about a remnant. So, the job is there. It's a big cause. It's a true cause. Are we doing it? And when I say we because, I don't want to be up here alone. I have to be honest, I don't do it like I ought to. I don't take advantage of every opportunity that I get. And I should, but I don't. I've had opportunities that I knew I missed, and I prayed to God that He'd give it back to me. And on occasion or two, He has. And man, you can't miss that one. I mean, you could. But it's very humbling when that happens. But anyway, David said, is there not a cause? And we as Christians, as church members, we know that's true. And like Brother Kevin talked about, all the things we see in our nation, our communities, just accent that cause is there. And our job, our duty, is to spread the message. It's not our duty to save anybody, because we can't. We have the message, we can tell them, and they can be saved just like we've been saved. But we cannot save them. And we cannot can't say the word. We can't make them be saved. We can't even make them want to be saved. But we got the message to give, and we're to give that message earnestly. We're not to be flippant about it. We're not to be nonchalant about it. Now, I'm not saying we got to jump up and down or anything. I just mean we have to be earnest about it and telling it that it's a very true thing and a very needful thing. And the good thing is, David said, is there not a cause? The good thing is, God has given us the job as saved people, as church members, to spread the gospel. To spread the gospel. But as Christ said, we spread the gospel, but God gives the increase. He's the one that makes that seed germinate and make the change. He is the one that sends the Holy Spirit to take the words that, as you remember when you were saved. Because I can remember, I grew up in church. I mean, I don't ever remember not going to church. But I can remember going to church when it never bothered me to listen to the salvation message. Didn't bother me at all. I can remember that. For years. Didn't bother me to hear it. I enjoyed going. Had fun in Sunday school, my friends, all that stuff, And I remember it didn't bother me to listen to the preacher. But then one day it did. Then one day I realized, he's talking to me. Wait a minute. This ain't right. But I realized it was true. Then I got to thinking about the Lord coming back. And I wasn't too keen on that, because I knew I wasn't ready. We'll see the same thing is we present the gospel. You don't talk anybody into anything, but you present the truth of the gospel, and you let God, through the Holy Spirit, make it real to them. Now, I'm not saying you don't keep talking to them if you have opportunity. Sometimes you don't get that. Sometimes you get a one-shot time. But I had one guy one time. I tried witnessing to him, and I said, now, of course, it was kind of awkward because I'm his boss. I told him, I said, now, I know I'm talking to you about the Lord, and I said, but when you listen to me like that, don't think about me being your boss. It's just Brian, you and me talking. So if you ever say, hey, enough's enough, I said, just let me know. So we were sitting there taking a break one day, and he says, hey, you remember you told me that if I ever had enough of that about Jesus, to let you know? I said, yeah. He said, well, I've had enough. I said, okay, that's fine. Now, I still would talk to him occasionally, maybe not as often, occasionally, and maybe not as long, but I didn't push it. But he was there for a few years and left and then came back. And then a few years after that, he left and was gone. And he sent me word. I don't know, he'd been gone 2 or 3 years. Let me know through somebody else, hey, tell Brian I found God. Wow. And he's passed away since then, just a few years ago. But we need to be busy. And we need to be like David. Because there is a cause. And it's a very important cause. Well, I'm going to have to get on it or I'm not going to get through the lesson. Anyway. It's in verse 31, when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. Saul has forgotten something that he knew at one time, that it's God who does the fighting. Saul had forgot that. We know by this time Saul had the kingdom had already been taken from Saul's followers. God's proclamation. It hadn't physically happened yet, but Saul was not in touch with God. He had forgotten. He had wasted all that. I still believe Saul was a saved man, but he had been put on the shelf basically because of his actions and his unbelief. We don't want to be put on the shelf, and it can happen. It can happen. David says, and physically speaking, Saul was right. This can't happen. This man's a grown man, a warrior, and he's been a warrior from the time he was young. They trained him to be a warrior. You're just a youth. You're not even a soldier. And David said, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear. Now, I don't think this necessarily happened at the same time. It might have been, I don't know. But he says a bear and a lion. So it had to be two different creatures because they're not the same kind of creature. Whether they came at the same time, different time, I don't know. But they came. And they took a lamb. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure that I would have not been very hesitant to go after either one of those for a lamb. They had lots of sheep, I think. I don't think they had a few like Eliab said, because Jesse had a reputation as a man among men. I kind of think he had a few, more than just a few, but it doesn't really matter. But I'm not sure I would have went after that one sheep. But David did. And he tells him, and he said, I went after him, smote him, delivered it out of his mouth, and when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him and slew him. That servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. He said, I'm not afraid of this man. He said, I slew the bear, I slew the lion, and I don't think he was bragging on what he'd done. I think because he was trusting God in that too, because he had a job to do for his dad, and that was to watch the flock and to take care of them. And he trusted God. I think, it doesn't say a whole lot, but he trusted God, I believe. I believe David was already a young man that was trusting in the Lord in every aspect of his life. Now we know as David got old, he made some mistakes, and he did some horrible things. But he repented of those things. And in the physical life, he paid price for those things. And we will too in this physical life. But he said, I was able to do that. And he's not bragging on himself. because he knew where the strength came from. He knew it was God. And he said, this Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me, because he knew the Lord delivered him. He knew it wasn't on his own. The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Did Saul believe it was going to happen? I don't know. I don't know if he did or not. But he thought, well, got to give it a shot. And Saul armed David with his armor and put a helmet of brass on his head, and he also armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded the sword upon his armor, or upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. He said, I don't know how to, and David put them off. He said, I don't know how to use this stuff. He said, I've never used this stuff. Plus, you got to figure this. Coat of mail, hit the helmet of brass. And again, Saul was a big man himself. It says his head and shoulders above all Israel. David, I don't think was that big of a guy. I'm not saying he was necessarily a shrimp, but I don't think he was that big of a man, at least not at this time. But they put that on him. He says, I can't use this. I don't know how to use it. I'm not used to this. So he took it off. So he took his staff, his shepherd's staff. So he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about, he's looking about, he saw somebody coming, and he looked about. I think he probably did a double take, He looks about and saw David and disdained him, and belittled him. He thought, they got to be kidding me. Because, number one, you could tell he was a youth. Number 2, he had no shield. He had no armor. He had no bow and arrow. He had no sword. He had a staff. I don't think Goliath saw the sling, which wouldn't have mattered to him anyway, but a staff, and he's thinking, what is this? He saw David and disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy, and of fair countenance. In other words, he did not look like a fighting man in any form or fashion at all. And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves and other shepherd's staff? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said unto David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. He was insulted. He said, what? This is a joke. You're coming to, come on, we'll take care of this real quick. Then David said to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. He said, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, of the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. He said, you got a sword, you got a shield. He said, you got a spear. You ain't got nothing. You ain't got nothing. Because I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of this army that you have defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and I will take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Because David's telling him, that's who's going to do it. He said, you've defied his armies. You've defied him. You're going to pay. I mean, that's kind of maybe a crude way to say it, but that's basically what he's telling you. You're going to pay. You've defied, you're going to pay. And so is the rest of your army. Verse 17 says, "And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands." And He's talking about not just Himself, now He's talking about the whole thing. And all this. He said, they're going to, the Lord, not only they're going to know that there is a God in Israel, they're also going to know that it's God who does the saving. It's God who does the work. Because it's not going to be all the swords and all this. It's God. He's the one that makes it happen. He's the one that makes it come to pass. Well, that didn't scare Goliath much, because he didn't believe. And that's what you'll find with people when you talk to them. Lots of times it won't mean much to them when you try to talk to them about God, because they don't believe. I mean, let's face it. If you're saved now, there was a time you didn't believe. You may have thought you did. You may have went to church just like I did. Believed in God, but not really. You didn't know the real God. You just heard the stories until the Lord got hold of you. And he didn't. Goliath didn't believe. Said he came, well, okay. And he came, drew nigh to meet David. He was figuring it's going to be a little short work of this. And David hasted and ran to him, ran toward him. And he starts running, and he put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone and slang it. I mean, gets it out, sling it, boom. And it smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk in his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And so David prevailed over Philistine with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took out his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Now, again, it's kind of that thing. There's this little guy out there standing on top of their champion who is now dead. His armor bearer didn't do anything either. I don't know what I don't know what his shield bearer did. Doesn't mention him anymore. I mean, David doesn't say anything. David did anything to him. I don't know if he ran right away, but the rest of the armies did. When they saw Goliath went down, they ran. They got as afraid as Israel had been. And they ran. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou comest to the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell by the way to Sheramim, even to Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines. They spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling is. Again, David was a little young man. He was a young man. He wasn't a real great big guy. Call him a stripling or a stripling, or however you say that. And David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, and Abner took him, brought him before Saul, and the head of the Philistine was in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David said, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So my whole point really to this whole thing is verse 29. There is a cause. There is a cause. And it's a very important cause. And we need to be busy about that cause. Whether our part in it is considered little, medium, big, whatever. And that can all change from time to time. You never know. You never know what God's got for us. So that would be my point. Just like David says, there is a cause. Like in Brother Kevin's lesson, world's out there, and there's people, they're lost, and they're dying and going to hell. They need to hear it. What they do with it, that's between them and God. But we got to give it. We got to give the message. And we need to be supportive of each other as a church. We need to be supportive of each other. We don't need to be like Eliab was to David. You know, we don't need to be that way. Now, if we know someone is doing something that's anti-scriptural, we need to try to, when we know that, we need to try to help them. And we need to be kind about it. But when someone's just thinking they've got this work to do, we got to be careful sometimes that we try to discourage them because we know we're not doing it and we're ashamed. But instead of actually saying, I need to help this person with it, we get the other way and we try to discourage them or demean them. We've got to be so careful we don't fall into that, because that's in our human nature to do that. It's there. And that's something we fight with every day. I do. Maybe you don't. I do. Because I know me. And so I just ask that you pray for me, that I wouldn't do that I wouldn't be an Elib, that I'd be a David. And I pray for our church. And I know we went through some rough times here lately, and we're not all able to be back yet. Just pray that happen, that we'd be back together. Pray especially for Brother Wayne and Sister Jessie, and that he could get over this. And I know his desire is to be here. I know it is. Me and him have not talked, but text, because I know, like, when I was sick, I didn't feel like talking. So I would text people off and on. And so me and him have been texting, but I know it's his desire to be here, to be behind the pulpit, preaching and teaching and being help to people. So pray for him and the others that are sick. And pray that for our church. Pray for the Wheatfield Mission. And most of all, pray for each one of us that we would be doing what we need to do and following the Lord and trusting Him with it all. Because there is a cause. There is a cause. Okay, let's stand together.